Political system. The reigns of the first four Hanoverian kings, George I to IV, from 1714 to 1830, are often designated as the Georgian era, although some historians might also include the reign of William IV, that is, from 1714 to 1837. Partly because the first two Georges took little interest in the politics of rule and were quite content to let ministers rule on their behalf. In this period, the very nature of the political face of the realm changed. These ministers, representatives of the king or prime minister, on the other hand, rather enjoyed ruling, and throughout this Georgian period, the foundations of the English political party system were solidified into something resembling what it is today. Parliament emerged as the leading force in government. The Hanoverians ruled as constitutional monarchs indirectly through appointed ministers who gathered and managed supporters in Parliament. Landowners eligible to vote elected a new House of Commons every 7 years. Although membership into the upper house of Parliament, the House of Lords remained limited to hereditary and appointed lords and high church clergy. Parliament passed laws, controlled foreign policy, and approved the taxes that allowed the monarch to pay the salaries of officials, the military, and the royal family. The Hanoverian monarchs associated the Whig Party with the revolution that brought them to power and suspected the Tory party of Jacobitism. As a result, the Whigs dominated the governments of George I and George II. Neither king was a forceful monarch. George I spoke no English and was more interested in German politics than he was in British politics. George II was preoccupied with family problems, particularly by an ongoing personal feud with his son. They were both concerned with European military affairs and left the British government in the hands of their ministers, the most important of whom was Sir Robert Walpole, who led the British government for almost 20 years, first as a member of Parliament, then in increasingly important offices, and finally as Prime Minister. However, throughout the Georgian period, the political rights of ordinary men and women were extremely limited. Only those with substantial property or wealth were entitled to vote. This amounted to around 200,000 men, which was only a tiny fraction of the population. Many members of Parliament were elected to represent rodent boroughs. These were boroughs in which just a handful of voters had disproportionate representation in Parliament. Many large towns like Manchester, on the other hand, which were expanding quickly as a result of migration and industrialization, had no separate representation at all until the passing of the First Reform Act in 1832. Although the majority of the British population had no right to vote, the influence of public opinion was extremely strong. The wills of the people were expressed in many different ways. For example, the leading political factions of the period, the Whigs and the Tories, were endlessly bullied and ridiculed in print, and like today, reputations could rise and fall quickly according to public opinion. Most politicians were satirized mercilessly in cartoons by leading artists, and there was a huge market for political pamphlets. This political feature was to produce profound impact on literature in this period. The most striking political feature of the time was the rise of constitutional and party government. The two main parties, the liberal Whigs and the conservative Tories, were so well balanced that power shifted easily from one to the other. To overturn a Tory or a Whig cabinet, only a few votes were necessary, and to influence such votes, London was flooded with pamphlets. Even before the great newspapers appeared, the press had become a mighty power in England, and any writer with a talent for argument or satire was almost certain to be hired by party leaders. Joseph Addison, Richard Steele, Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, most of the great writers of the age were, on occasion, the willing contributors of the political literature. Another feature of the age was the rapid development of social life. In earlier ages, the typical Englishman had lived much by himself. His home was his castle. and in it he developed his intense individualism. However, the 18th century was the age of town life with its coffee houses and clubs. The influence of the social life on literature was inevitable. Nearly all writers frequented the coffee houses and clubs, and matters discussed there became subjects of literature. The most famous one was the Scribblers Club, whose members included Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and John Gay. Its purpose was to defend and uphold high literature standards against the rising tide of middle-class values and tastes. As it was the age of social, political, religious, and literary controversies in which the prominent writers took an active part, and the masses took a great interest, poetry was considered inadequate, and for the first time in the history of English literature, prose occupied the front position. In fact, the prose writers of this age excelled the poets in every respect. The graceful and elegant prose of Addison's Essays, the terse style of Swift's satires, the sonorous eloquence of Gibbon's History, and the oratorical style of Burke have no equal in the poetical works of the age. In fact, poetry also became prosaic because it was no longer used for lofty and sublime purposes, but, like prose, its subject matter had become criticism, satire, and controversy, so it was also written in the form of the essay, which was the common literary form. In the first half of the century could be called the Age of Satire, dominated by Swift and Pope. The second half, the Age of Johnson. It was characterized by the literary circle, which included Samuel Johnson, the Senator, Joshua Reynolds, David Garrick, Edmund Burke, Oliver Goldsmith, and James Boswell, whose biography of Johnson is a classic of the genre. Dr. Johnson, who carried the arts of criticism and conversation to new heights, both typified and helped to form mid-18th century views of life, literature, and conduct. Other great master prose writers of the period were historian Edward Gibbon and the philosopher David Hume. The realism of the age and the development of an excellent prose style greatly helped in the evolution of the novel during the 18th century. This new literary form, which gained great popularity in the succeeding ages, and which at present holds the prominent place, was fed and nourished by great masters like Defoe, Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and others who laid its secure foundations. However, the 18th century was deficient in drama because the old Puritanic prejudice against the theater continued, and the court also withdrew its patronage. Goldsmith and Sheridan were the only writers who produced plays with a literary merit. The political system of the Georgian era changed fundamentally. Parliament emerged as the leading force in government. The Hanoverians ruled as constitutional monarchs indirectly through appointed ministers, who gathered and managed supporters in Parliament. Landowners eligible to vote elected a new House of Commons every 7 years, although membership into the upper House of Parliament, the House of Lords, remained limited to hereditary and appointed lords and high church clergy. Although the majority of the British population had no right to vote, the influence of public opinion was extremely strong. There are 4 features of Georgian literature. First, the political environment stimulated the need for argument and satire, so that most of the great writers of the age were willing contributors of political literature. Second, the development of social life gave rise to various literature clubs, to which prominent writers frequently attended. Third, social, political, religious, and literary controversies rendered poetry inadequate and pushed prose style to the front position. Fourth, the realism of the age and the development of prose greatly helped in the evolution of the novel during the 18th century, which was to shine dazzling in the succeeding century.
That's all for today's lecture. Thanks for listening.